around and crushes everything in the coast. It's not a Godzilla kind of scenario. It can be as little as 14 or 15 inches, yet it may cause the disruption of oil flows for countries.
Exactly.
It may drown Bangladesh. There are a lot of these
2 feet
lowland
could change everything.
Correct. And so it can be catastrophic without necessarily being overly dramatic. However, the data seems to suggest that whatever our first issue with the global coastal event is, it will be replicated in a much larger extent sometime in 2010, 2011. And the only thing we can think of at that point is that, well, we're getting indications now that we've passed the ability of the glaciers to reform themselves. In spite of the seeming evidence to the snowpack in the eastern Antarctic glacier, we've passed the magic 2.5 degrees centigrade, and thus we have the Greenland glacier melting irretrievably, and we have the Antarctic glacier melting irretrievably. It's only a question of how long. What a lot of the scientists don't appear to understand is that the tipping point event, or the tipping point math, seems to apply not only to populaces, large populations of humans or flocks of birds, for instance. All the birds are flying along, there might be 10,000 of them, and all of a sudden, so it appears to us, they all seem to turn on a dime. And really, that's not the case. There is a definitive flow pattern within that, but at some point, a large enough mass of that huge part of the flock of birds has shifted that to our eyes it appears as the whole thing has shifted. And that tipping point exists also in geophysical processes, and we may find that it doesn't matter if the Antarctic glaciers melt if they get merely enough lubrication underneath of them to go walkabout.
Fascinating. There is a debate over whether the planet is actually getting colder or hotter. I mean, it's weird. IceAgeNow.com is a very provocative site and tends to document that things are getting colder. Most of the world's glaciers are actually growing, so it's murky. All right, back in just a minute. Okay, and welcome back. George Ure, urbansurvival.com, and Clif Hoigh, halfpasthuman.com. You might want to think about getting up to at least the 2,000 or 3,000 foot level, Clif, somewhere.
It's kind of I'm boxed in by fate. I have too many family obligations in the area.
Don't you have any 2,000 footers near you at all?
We do, and that's easily obtainable in the Olympics or whatever. And I'm very good with boats. I've got a bunch of kayaks, and I've got an Umiak, and at the moment I'm building a Sharpie, so I'll be able to go sail about with alternative energy here.
I see. Neat.
So in that regard, I'm keeping busy. And we also have to acknowledge that even if all of the glaciers on the planet were to melt, the pretty much definitive word on the expansion level would be about 80 plus meters, but less than 90 meters of adjusted height.
Which is why I'm at about 600 feet in East Texas.
Right, and I'm a little below that. I'm at about 135 to 150 feet up above the Puget Sound, but we're far enough inland that we would have a little bit of notice, I'm sure.
I chickened down, went up to 2,500.
And I wish I could. There's no possible way around here with the housing market and the circumstances.
Oh, yeah.
It just isn't going to happen.
All right.
Besides which, we see the economic conditions so deteriorating past October that it may even get to the point where there must be necessarily large amounts of government layoffs, including people that do things like register titles.
Very good. Okay, understood. Let's go to Clif now. All right, let's talk about the economy and how it looks for the rest of this year of manifestation. Clif.
Well, we have a tendency to split language into two types, building tension language and release language. Release language is where you're sort of like getting it out of your system. Okay. And on a collective way, we think that that's going to occur starting around the 7th of October. And
now, you said the 7th again. That's very interesting.
The data has not shifted. The data still shows the 7th of October, and still it varies between 10 after 7 on that day and 12 after 7 at this point.
Really?
Yeah.
All right.
Just a little tiny bit, but not much.
All right, now that's a release point. George, very quickly, give us your take. What does release mean to us?
What it means is, to me, is that's when you look for either a bespoke or a fundamental change in a market psychology. it would be like, based on the timing that we're looking at for that date, the U.S. markets would not be open, but maybe something happens in the European markets that causes the huge run on the dollar to begin that day. Maybe oil jumps to 150, 175, 200, whatever. It'll be something like that. It may not even be visible. It could be some subtle shift in LIBOR, but it also could be a real obvious event. And remember that once the event occurs, it may not go mainstream for weeks later.
In this case, though, we're looking at release language that shifts on a dime, which is atypical. We don't usually see this. Usually we see sort of a sawtooth, alligator tooth kind of a pattern of up and down, and then a general trend line up or down, with the up being our arbitrary designation for building tension and the down being our arbitrary.
You're talking about some kind of a definitive moment that day.
Correct.
Or hours or something. That's a Tuesday, by the way. It's a Tuesday.
It could be an event, but as George says, it could be something that doesn't occur. So, for instance, it could be that, for instance, we get a lockup in the sense that at that particular moment, someone demands that one of those derivatives pay off, and it doesn't. And thereafter, we have all these people, especially market-related, especially economic-related people, running around ripping the hair out of their heads and screaming out release words all over the place.
Now,
and it continues for some number of months, and it does not bode well.
All right. In your last visit, that was what I was going to extemporize on. As I recall, you said whatever happens on October 7th, and both of you are saying the date is not shifting, will have worldwide ramifications, if I'm remembering correctly, for well into 2009, at least the first quarter of 2009.
No, 2010.
That's before there will be any let-up at all. Correct.
2010? So this thing will go on for over a year?
Much over a year, but however, let's be real clear about this. George is quite correct. The overall trend line of release language continues well into July of 2010.
Wow.
But the first initial downward slope goes from the 7th of October until the very end of February in 2009. And
then
we
get a couple of bounce.
And exactly. Then we get a couple of little bits of relief, if you will, from the release language, where we're all going around and wiping our brows. Boy, we made it this far, before the next outbreak of release language strikes a few days later. But that general pattern from that point on is still holding sway until about July of 2010, as near as we can tell at this point.
What the hell could that be? It has to be economic, right? I mean, that's the number one guess.
That's over 41% of it, correct.
How much?
41% of the language at this point is
is suggesting the economy.
The economy, correct. And a global depression would certainly fit the bill.
Is that a high percentage of language indicating a particular area, 41%?
Yeah.
Is it growing?
Usually it's single digits.
Really?
Usually a very high range might be 9% overall, because we're tracking so many different things.
Okay, well, this is huge then. All right. You're then, at this point, when we come back, it would appear that this is not necessarily going to be war, although a war could trigger it, yes?
Yes.
Yes.
All right. We're talking about the potential infrastructure collapse of much of the world financial systems, possibly. October 7th. That's the day that Mario Lanza died. I thought, no, you know.
Is that what the fat lady
says?
For us fans, that was a big day. You guys remember Lanza?
Yeah.
You know I produce Lanza CDs?
No.
Oh, we'll talk. Be right back. Okay, well, quite a conversation tonight. As you've heard, something coming up in October, and apparently the data is sustaining October 7th as the day so far, which will be witness to an event of some kind, probably economic, and it could be tied to a war. Their two are almost joined at the hip, and it will go on for well over a year and a half, if we're talking October, November, December, the year of 2009, and into the first quarter of 2010. This is a world-changing event. And from the looks of the way, George, the economy continues to show signs of terminal, it's a fatal configuration. it wouldn't surprise me to see it continue to erode and then on the heels of some other event, maybe not, literally implode. And the Chinese, of course, would step right in. They could cause much of that implosion.
Not only that, but you have to remember that the Fed is in a terrible box. Ben Bernanke and company are trying to keep enough liquidity in the system that we won't see deflation really take hold. But the problem that they're running into is that there is enough inflation. I'm sure you saw both the PPI and the CPI were out, producer price index and consumer price index out this week. And even though they vastly understate the reality that we're running into at Safeway and Walmart and Kroger's and A&P and whatever, nevertheless, at some point that begins to constrain the Fed, because if inflation at the retail level begins to kick up, then they won't be able to drop the interest rates. Then they've really got problems. Not that they don't now. So right now we're in this window where, again, I see a little bubble here of a rally, perhaps up to maybe a new high is not out of the question. Maybe, 14,000.
That's insane. That's complete insanity.
Of course it's insane, but so what? The markets are crazy.
You also have to bear in mind, of course, that George is talking about a new high with much devalued dollars.
Right.
So it almost stands to reason that they have to have a new high simply because the dollar is worth so much.
Got it.
It's kind of like valuing an apartment house. If you're dealing with an apartment house in 1950, it's a $25,000 apartment house. In 1970, it's a $100,000 apartment house, and today it's $1.5 million. So the Dow can go up in nominal terms, but in purchasing power parity, what you can buy in the way of calories is going to go down, because we also have this other ugly thing with encounters with scarcity, which continues to accrete values.
Yeah,
wow.
We have these metadata layers, we call them, that seem to be these larger themes that are playing out as we act out our daily interactions with each other. And it's sort of how the economists view the interaction of millions of people, and thus a market is born, and the concept of a market. We just take one larger step back and look at the planet and say, what kind of metadata layers or what kind of themes are playing out through humanity as a whole? Are there any? And, well, it turns out there are. And there's actually many layers of them, and they can be very expressive. So as George is saying, we have this encounters with scarcity, and the other side of that same coin is restrictions on movement. The linguistics support an interpretation either way. So you could have a restriction on movement that also impacts your ability to get at corn, for instance. And these kind of metadata layers have been expressing themselves since probably much longer than we've discovered them, but we've been aware of them since 2003 perhaps, and they've been increasing in their emotive sums, the actual numeric values that we're using. So they're apparently going to be much more slap-you-in-the-face kind of thing as we go forward.
I see.
The food riots, which we were talking about, maybe 2003, George? We started advising everybody to start growing all of their own pie material?
Right,
wow.
right.
5 years ago.
But you have to realize, Jeff, that when the stories begin, like the food shortages, we've been talking about that for a year and a half, longer than that, really, down at the archetype level. But as these things bubble up toward the surface, the news events are there in front of the aware observer right now, with like the UG99 wheat virus or rust.
Oh,
and
yes.
Okay, now that's going to go around the world.
We had, let me interrupt, George, we had the fungus among us.
Fungus among us was 2 years ago.
2 years ago.
And it was the wheat virus.
Correct.
Right.
Okay, so already all-time high wheat prices, and wheat now facing potential catastrophe from